Chicago, 1968. Somewhere past midnight, in a blues club so small that the cigarette smoke had nowhere to go but into your lungs, a question was about to be asked that nobody in the room expected. Not the bartender who had stopped pouring drinks 10 minutes ago. Not the handful of musicians crowded around a corner table. Not even the man who would ask it. The question was simple. Can you play the blues without hiding behind anything? No effects, no volume, no tricks, just fingers, strings, and whatever truth lives inside your chest. The man asking was Buddy Guy, and the man he was asking had just set the entire world of rock and roll on fire. But the answer that came back from that stripped-down guitar would do something far more dangerous than fire ever could. It would make one of the greatest blues musicians alive sit down, and close his eyes and wonder if he had ever really understood the instrument he had spent his whole life playing. But before we get to that moment, we need to understand why it mattered so much. And to understand that, we need to understand who Buddy Guy was in 1968 and why Jimi Hendrix walking into his world felt like a foreign language being spoken in a sacred church. Buddy Guy was not just another blues guitarist. By the late 1960s, he had already earned a reputation as one of the most ferocious and emotionally raw performers in the history of Chicago blues. Born in Lettsworth, Louisiana, he had moved to Chicago in 1957, drawn by the same magnetic pull that brought so many young black musicians north, the promise that the city's South Side clubs could turn a country boy with a guitar into somebody worth listening to. And Chicago delivered on that promise, but not gently. The city's blues scene was a proving ground. You did not earn respect by talking about what you could do. You earned it by doing it, night after night, in front of audiences who had heard Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf and Little Walter play live, audiences who knew what greatness sounded like because they had been standing 3 feet away from it since before you were born. Buddy survived that proving ground. More than survived. He thrived. His style was volcanic. He bent strings until they screamed. He played at volumes that made club owners nervous. He used feedback before feedback had a name in popular music. And here is a detail most biographies mention only in passing. Years before Jimi Hendrix became famous for playing guitar behind his back and with his teeth, Buddy Guy was already doing it on the stages of Chicago's South Side. The showmanship the world would later associate with Hendrix had deep roots in the blues tradition that Buddy embodied. But here is where the tension begins. By 1968, Buddy Guy was watching something happen that troubled him deeply. A young guitarist from Seattle had gone to London, plugged into a wall of Marshall amplifiers, covered himself in psychedelic colors and feedback and distortion, and the entire world had lost its mind. Jimi Hendrix was everywhere. His face was on magazine covers. His records were selling millions. Critics were calling him the greatest guitarist who ever lived. And Buddy Guy, sitting in his Chicago clubs playing the music that had built the foundation for everything Hendrix did, could not help but feel something complicated about all of it. It was not jealousy, not exactly. Buddy was too proud and too talented for simple jealousy. It was something deeper. A question that gnawed at him during late nights after the clubs closed and the amplifiers cooled down. Did this kid actually understand the blues? Or had he just taken the surface of it, the volume, the showmanship, the raw energy, and wrapped it in psychedelic packaging for white audiences who did not know the difference? That question was not unique to Buddy. Across the blues community, older musicians were asking the same thing. They had spent decades perfecting an art form that required suffering to understand. You could not play the blues if you had not lived the blues. That was the unspoken rule. And here was Jimi Hendrix, 25 years old, surrounded by British musicians, embraced by a white rock audience, making the guitar do things that sounded more like science fiction than Saturday night at a juke joint. Where was the blues in that? But there was one detail that Buddy Guy knew and most critics did not. Before Jimi Hendrix became Jimi Hendrix, before London, before the psychedelic revolution, before any of it, he had been Jimi, a sideman on the Chitlin Circuit, the network of clubs and venues across the American South where black musicians played for black audiences. He had backed Little Richard. He had played behind the Isley Brothers. He had paid dues in the same world that had shaped Buddy Guy. The question was whether any of that foundation remained, or whether it had been buried under layers of effects pedals and Marshall stacks and the expectations of an audience that wanted spectacle more than soul. If that question was about to be answered in the most direct way possible. The club was called Teresa's Lounge. Some accounts place the encounter at other South Side venues, and the exact details have been debated by music historians for decades. But the essence of what happened has been described consistently enough across multiple sources to paint a clear picture. It was late, past the hour when casual listeners had gone home and only the serious musicians remained. The kind of hour when the music stopped being entertainment and became conversation, when guitarists traded licks the way poets trade verses, each one trying to say something the others had not thought of yet. Buddy was there with a small circle of musicians. The word had spread that Hendrix was in Chicago. He had a concert scheduled, one of the massive arena shows that had become his reality. Thousands of screaming fans, walls of amplifiers, a production designed to overwhelm the senses. But before that show, before the spectacle, Jimi had done what he always did when he visited a city with a blues tradition. He went looking for the real music. He walked into the club quietly. Off stage, Jimi Hendrix was almost unrecognizable. The wild, commanding presence that dominated arenas disappeared completely. In its place was someone shy, soft-spoken, almost fragile. He wore simple clothes. His voice, when he spoke at all, was barely above a whisper. He found a seat near the back and ordered a drink, and for a while he simply listened. Buddy noticed him. Everyone noticed him. It was impossible not to. Jimi Hendrix was the most famous guitarist on the planet, and he was sitting in a small blues club on the south side of Chicago like a student who had shown up early for a class he was not sure he belonged in. But Buddy did not approach him immediately. He kept playing, kept working through the sets, kept letting the music build the way Chicago blues was supposed to build, from a whisper to a roar and back again, each song a journey through emotional territory that could not be mapped, only felt. Between sets, someone made the introduction. Buddy Guy, Jimi Hendrix. Two guitarists from different worlds that shared the same roots. The handshake was brief. Jimmy's grip was gentle, his eyes respectful, almost reverent. There was a moment of small talk, the kind of careful conversation that happens when two people are circling a subject neither wants to bring up directly. But underneath the pleasantries, Buddy was studying Jimmy the way a mechanic studies an engine, looking for what was real and what was performance. And then the question came. Not aggressively, not as an insult, but with the directness that Chicago blues demanded. A world where you said what you meant and meant what you said. Buddy gestured toward a guitar sitting nearby. A clean instrument. No effects chain, no pedals, no rack of processing equipment. Just a guitar and a small amplifier. The kind of setup that left nowhere to hide. Every mistake would be audible. Every weakness would be exposed. Every note would stand or fall on its own merit, naked and unprotected. He asked Jimmy to play the blues. Real blues, the kind that comes from the gut, not from a pedal board, and the kind that does not need volume or distortion or psychedelic production to make people feel something. Strip it all away, all the things that made Jimi Hendrix famous, and show me what is underneath. Show me the foundation. Show me the truth. The room went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of a pause between songs, but the charged quiet that happens when everyone understands that something important is about to occur. The other musicians stopped what they were doing. Glasses were set down on tables. Conversations ended mid-sentence. The air itself seemed to thicken with anticipation. Jimmy looked at the guitar for a long moment. Then he looked at Buddy, and something passed between them that did not require words. An acknowledgement that this was not a casual invitation. This was a test. and both of them knew it. Jimi stood up and walked to the guitar with deliberate calm. He picked up the instrument carefully and began tuning. Each string received his complete attention. He did not rush. He did not try to fill the silence with casual playing or warm-up licks. He simply prepared the instrument with the methodical patience of someone who understood that the relationship between a musician and a guitar begins before the first note is ever played. The amplifier was small. The volume was low. The tone was clean, brutally clean, the kind of transparent sound that reveals everything and forgives nothing. This was not the wall of marshals that Jimi used on stage. This was a setup that would show exactly who he was as a musician, stripped of every external support system that fame had built around him. Then he started playing. And within the first 4 bars, the entire room understood that they had been asking the wrong question. The question was never whether Jimi Hendrix could play the blues. The question should have been whether anyone alive could play it the way he was about to. The first notes were quiet, almost tentative. A simple phrase that any blues guitarist might play, a few notes climbing a minor pentatonic scale with the unhurried patience of someone who had all night and nowhere else to be. But something in the way he touched the strings was different. The notes did not just sound, they ached. Each one carried a weight that had nothing to do with volume or distortion or any electronic enhancement. It was the weight of feeling, of lived experience translated into vibration, and of something that could not be faked because it came from a place deeper than technique. Buddy Guy felt his posture change. He had been leaning against the bar with casual confidence, but now he straightened, his attention sharpening. This was not what he had anticipated. He had expected competence, maybe. Skill, certainly. What Buddy had doubted was whether that ability was connected to anything real, whether the pyrotechnics and the feedback were a substitute for genuine emotional depth or an expression of it. The answer came in the space between notes. Jimi was not just playing the blues. He was speaking it, the way a native speaker uses a language they learned before they could remember learning it. In his phrasing reached back through Muddy Waters and Robert Johnson and Charlie Patton to the field hollers and work songs that predated recorded music entirely. Jimi was accessing something ancient, and he was doing it with a naturalness that suggested he had never really left it behind. The psychedelic revolution, the burning guitars, the cosmic imagery, all of it had been built on top of this foundation, not instead of it. His fingers bent a string and the note cried out with a tone that Buddy recognized immediately. It was the same tone that the great blues masters had spent their lives chasing, the sound of a guitar imitating the human voice at its most vulnerable, the crack in a singer's throat when emotion overwhelms technique, when the song becomes more important than the singer. Most guitarists could approximate that sound. Jimi was not approximating. He was channeling it directly, as if the guitar had become a translator between his nervous system and the air molecules in the room. 2 minutes in, and Buddy Guy had not moved. His arms were crossed, but not defensively. He was listening with the kind of intensity that only another master can bring to the experience of witnessing mastery. The way Jimi used dynamics, moving from whispers to controlled shouts within a single phrase, the way he employed silence, leaving gaps that spoke as loudly as the notes themselves, the way every bend, every vibrato served the emotional narrative rather than existing as a display of technical facility. But there was something else happening that went beyond technique. Jimi was telling a story. Without words, without lyrics, so that the guitar was narrating something that everyone in the room could feel but nobody could have described. It was the story of being caught between worlds, 2 blues for rock, 2 rock for blues. The story of loneliness that lives inside fame, the particular isolation of being surrounded by people who love what you do but do not understand who you are. Buddy felt something tighten in his chest, not just admiration, recognition. He knew that story. Every blues musician knew that story. It was the story the blues had been telling since before anyone thought to give it a name. And Jimi was telling it with a fluency that made Buddy realize this young man had not abandoned the tradition at all. He had internalized it so completely that it had become invisible, like the skeleton inside a body, unseen but supporting everything. 4 minutes in, Jimi shifted into something different. The tempo changed slightly, the key modulated, and suddenly the blues was not just looking backward anymore, it was looking forward. He began incorporating melodic ideas that hinted at the innovations he had brought to rock music, but stripped of their psychedelic production, they revealed themselves as natural extensions of the blues vocabulary rather than departures from it. What had sounded like revolution on his records now sounded like evolution, the logical next step in a musical conversation that had been going on for 100 years. Buddy uncrossed his arms. He leaned forward slightly. He was hearing things in Jimi's playing that he had thought about but never fully articulated. It extensions of the blues language that he himself had been reaching toward in his own most adventurous moments on stage. Jimi was not replacing the tradition. He was expanding it, adding rooms to a house that Buddy and the other blues masters had built, and doing it with such respect for the original architecture that the additions felt inevitable rather than intrusive. One of the other musicians in the room, a harmonica player who had been sitting quietly near the stage, later described this moment in terms that captured what everyone felt. He said it was like watching someone take a language you had spoken your entire life and reveal grammar you did not know existed. The words were familiar. The sentences were new. And somehow, impossibly, they made everything that came before sound richer instead of diminished. 5 minutes in, and the club had achieved a quality of silence that is almost impossible to create intentionally. It was the silence of 20 people breathing together, their attention so completely focused on a single source of sound that their individual identities had temporarily dissolved into a collective listening experience. The bartender stood motionless. The other musicians had stopped even pretending to do anything other than watch. Then Jimi did something unexpected. He began playing a progression that Buddy recognized instantly. It was one of Buddy's own signature licks, a musical fingerprint as distinctive as a voice. But Jimi did not play it as imitation. He played it as conversation, as acknowledgement, as a way of saying without words that he knew exactly where he came from and exactly who had helped him get there. Yet Buddy Guy felt something shift inside him. The doubt that had been sitting in his chest for months dissolved completely. Not because the question was answered, because it was exposed as the wrong question entirely. Jimi did not just understand the blues. He understood music, all of it, and the blues was not separate from anything else in his understanding. It was the foundation. It was the root system beneath a forest that most people only saw from above. 7 minutes in, Jimi brought the performance to its conclusion. He did not end with a dramatic flourish or a show-stopping climax. He let the music wind down naturally, the way a conversation winds down when everything important has been said, letting the notes become quieter and less frequent until the last one faded into the room's silence like smoke dissolving into air. When he stopped playing, Jimi carefully set the guitar down and looked at Buddy with an expression that carried no triumph, no satisfaction at having proven a point, just quiet respect, the same humility that everyone who knew him personally would describe for the rest of their lives. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The silence was necessary. The kind of silence that follows something important, when the world needs a moment to absorb what just happened. Buddy Guy was the first to break it. He walked over to Jimi slowly, still processing what he had just experienced. When he reached the young guitarist, he did not shake his hand. He embraced him. A brief, firm hug between two musicians who had just communicated everything that needed to be said through the only language that mattered. Then Buddy stepped back and said something that the other musicians in the room would repeat for decades. The exact phrasing varies depending on who tells the story, as is always the case with moments that become legend, but the essence is consistent across every account. Buddy told Jimi that he had been wrong. Not about the music, not about the blues, but about the assumption that playing loud and playing deep were somehow incompatible. That showmanship and soul could not coexist in the same performer. that the blues had boundaries that could not be crossed without losing something essential. Jimi responded the way he always responded to compliments from musicians he admired, quietly, almost shyly, deflecting the praise back toward its source. He told Buddy that everything he had just played, he had learned by listening to Buddy Guy records. The bend, the vibrato, the emotional transparency, all of it came from studying what Buddy and the other Chicago blues masters had created. There was something in Jimi's voice when he said this. Not false modesty. Genuine reverence. The kind of respect that comes from someone who has spent countless hours alone with a guitar and a record player, rewinding the same passages over and over, trying to understand not just what the notes were, but why they sounded the way they did. They talked for a long time after that. The conversation drifted from blues technique to the larger questions that all serious musicians eventually confront. What makes music real? Where does the line fall between honoring tradition and being trapped by it? How do you stay connected to the roots of your art while reaching for something nobody has heard before? Buddy asked Jimi about the effects, the feedback, the psychedelic production that defined his public sound. And Jimi explained something that most critics and fans had never understood. The effects were not a mask. They were an extension. The same way a painter moves from pencil to oils without abandoning the fundamentals, Jimi had expanded his palette without changing what he was trying to express. The blues was still there, underneath everything. The pain was still there. The joy was still there. It was just traveling through new circuits on its way to the listener's ear. Buddy nodded. He understood this better than almost anyone could. Because his own playing had always pushed against the boundaries of what blues audiences expected. His volume, his aggression, his physicality on stage had drawn criticism from blues purists who thought he was too loud, too wild, too much. In a sense, Buddy and Jimi were fighting the same battle from opposite sides of the same wall, both trying to expand the language of the guitar without losing the emotional core that gave the language meaning. In the years that followed, Buddy Guy would speak about Jimi Hendrix with a mixture of admiration and sorrow that reflected the complexity of their connection. He described Jimi as one of the few guitarists who truly understood what the blues was about, not as a style or a genre or a set of rules, but as an emotional technology for turning suffering into beauty. He described that late night in Chicago as a moment when his understanding of his own instrument was deepened by watching someone else play it. When Jimi died in September 1970, at the age of 27, the loss carried particular weight in the blues community. Here was a young man who had taken the blues global, had introduced its emotional vocabulary to audiences who might never have encountered it otherwise, had proven that the most ancient form of American music could speak to a generation that thought it had outgrown everything that came before. Buddy Guy continued playing for decades after that night. His career would eventually bring him the recognition he deserved: multiple Grammy Awards, induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, a Presidential Medal of Freedom. But those who knew him well said that something changed after his encounter with Jimi. Not his playing, exactly. His playing was already extraordinary. What changed was his relationship to the idea of tradition itself. He stopped seeing innovation as a threat to the blues and started seeing it as proof that the blues was strong enough to survive anything, to absorb anything, to transform anything it touched while remaining fundamentally, unshakably itself. The club where it happened has long since closed. The exact date remains debated. The precise words exchanged have been filtered through decades of retelling, but the core truth of that night persists in every account. Two guitarists walked into a room carrying different assumptions about what the other represented. One asked a question that could have been a confrontation. The other answered it with music so honest that the question dissolved before it could become a fight. What happened that night in Chicago was never really about effects or purity, volume or silence, tradition or revolution. It was about the moment when one master recognized another, not through words or reputation, but through the only evidence that has ever mattered in the history of the blues: the sound, the feeling, the thing that happens in the space between a vibrating string and a human heart that nobody has ever been able to explain and nobody has ever been able to fake. Buddy Guy asked Jimi Hendrix to play the blues, and Jimi responded by reminding everyone in that room, including himself, that he had never stopped.